It's 4:20, so you know what time it is. Time for our speaker. His name is Cowles. He comes to us from Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Now, Rock used to be a police officer in South Carolina for 5 years. He also worked in the Navy, the Army National Guard, 2 drug treatment centers, and in a tattoo parlor for a while. It was pretty cool. He started working for LEAP about seven years ago. It's his first time with us, and he wants to let you guys know that after he speaks, you guys are more than welcome to ask questions. So I'm going to give it over to Rock.
Hi. My hair okay? Appreciate it. I'm a member of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, also known as LEAP, which is an organization that was founded in 2002 by 5 police officers. 4 were retired and 1 was still active. And that sounds pretty insane to most people. Why would police support ending prohibition on drugs? We have the unique experience of seeing that it's the prohibition of drugs that causes a lot more problems than the actual pharmacology of drugs. For those who don't know much about the history of the war on drugs, they had the Harrison Narcotics Act in 1914, which basically put the government over doctors. Instead of doctors working for themselves, making recommendations that this is probably what would work, and you didn't even need a prescription, you'd go to the pharmacy and get it. If you didn't want to bother with the doctor, you could medicate yourself. They made most narcotics illegal, and a lot of that was basically pure racism. At that time it was opiates with a lot of the Asian migrant workers that had came over here. As things progressed in 1936, the movie Reefer Madness came out, which a lot of people think is a real funny movie, but when it came out, a lot of people didn't know much about drugs, and they believed that if you smoked pot one time, you could end up being insane forever, that you would rape people and basically be a terrorist. A lot of the reason why we are against prohibition is that the initial intent, so they say, wasn't to control people, but to control disease, death, drug abuse, and crime. And instead, everything has gotten much, much, much worse. In 1971, Richard Nixon decided that drug abuse was public enemy number 1 and declared the war on drugs. Now, I like most police officers and a lot of other people, carry a pocket knife. And to me, a pocket knife is a tool. It's got a lot of versatile things, but the knife itself isn't good or bad. It's not evil. It's a tool. Now, if somebody yells, "He's got a knife," it changes everybody's attitude, but it doesn't change the knife. And it's the same thing with drugs. Drugs are items. They don't possess morals. They don't make our decisions for us. They don't tell us how to run our lives. It's what you do with them that causes the problems. And by making them illegal and prohibiting them, we have turned the regulation of drugs over to criminals, to gangsters, to terrorists. In 1950, we had 250,000 people in the U.S. prisons. Now we have 2.3 million people in the U.S. prisons. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prison population, which is pretty horrifying, especially when you consider that half the people in those prisons are in there for drugs, and half the ones who are in there for drugs are in there for marijuana. They're users, they're consumers, they're not dealers, they're not kingpins, they're not bigwigs. They've killed over 30,000 people in the last 4 years alone with the drug cartels in Mexico over drugs. These, the facts are out there. Most people don't ignore them. They think, I don't smoke pot. I don't want people smoking pot around me. I don't want people doing heroin around me. They think that if we legalize drugs, it's going to turn into the Wild West. Places like Portugal and Switzerland have legalized drugs and have had amazing results. They've had no increase in addiction. Portugal had a 60% drop in crime. They've doubled their their employment rates, their AIDS and HIV and hepatitis rates have gone down significantly because they're letting people make their choices. We don't even have needle exchange programs in most places here, and that's one of the reasons why we have the diseases that we do, is because people are sharing dirty needles. Prior to Prohibition, drug overdoses were almost unheard of. People bought from pharmacies and they knew what they were getting and the quality and the purity of it, and they knew that if they went in on Sunday they got the same stuff that they got the last week. And that's not the case when you're buying from people on the street who are stepping on it and just making massive amounts of profit from it. There are a lot of constitutional issues too with Prohibition that most police officers don't like. We hear about things like drug seizures, where people will have their property seized without even having been convicted, and a lot of the time they'll be found not guilty and they won't get their property back. And the $1 million estates that's happened with. It's happened with people driving other people's cars. Now, when I was a police officer, when I first started, I was with the Gaffney Police Department. They allowed me to start riding with the officers while I was waiting to go to the academy. And there were neighborhoods in Gaffney that the police didn't go in unless they had a call. And when they went in those neighborhoods, they let everybody who worked there know that if I come in this neighborhood, somebody's going to jail. When they drove me around in those neighborhoods to show me the neighborhoods, they did it with their guns out on their lap. They were that concerned about people rushing their cars. And the drug dealers didn't hide. They'd stand out on the corners. And when you're a police officer, the last thing you want to think is that you're the only person with a gun, because it's not true. They taught us early on that every call you go to, there's a gun there. And in those neighborhoods, there were a lot. But the cops very much had a them and us attitude. And they considered these the drug areas rather than neighborhoods and homes and places where people were trying to raise their families, and they'd have meth labs and all sorts of other problems there that nobody wants to have to live with. But as I said, as Trey said, prior to being a police officer, I worked at a couple different drug treatment centers outside of Chicago, and one of them was a 3-quarter-way house for teenagers, and these were kids who had gone through a 30-day inpatient program, and their parents or their counselors felt like they weren't ready to go back home yet, so they would send them here. And there were kids who had smoked pot one time and told their parents, and their parents completely freaked out and put them in treatment where they get taught that because they've used them, they were an addict. For the rest of their life, they would have a problem. They couldn't drink a beer, they couldn't smoke a joint. They shouldn't take prescription medications for pain. And some of the kids were court mandated in this place. And we had kids in there who were little white bread suburbanites who got molested by hardcore inner city kids while they were in the treatment center, because that was where we put them. That was where their parents put them. And my example with the pocket knife is that the drugs themselves are not the problem. It's the prohibition and it's the prejudices against it. I mentioned the Narcotics Act. There's been a lot of things written about marijuana being banned because of Mexicans using it, of cocaine because of blacks using it. Proportionately, all the different races use drugs, but if you look at the people who are arrested for it, if you are a minority, you are 8 times more likely to be arrested, convicted, and incarcerated for using drugs than if you're white, which is something that a lot of people don't pay attention to, but it's part of that them or us mentality that people have, as well as people tend to like people who are like themselves, and if they're different, people tend to stay away from them. They segregate, they judge, and they don't take the time to learn about those other people. I backed up another officer one time on a traffic stop, and we had 4 black kids in the car, and he had got there first and had asked them for permission to search the car, and the boy driving it gave him permission. He said it was his aunt's car. He had his aunt's registration for the vehicle and insurance. And when the officer looked through the car, he found a prescription bottle under the seat with 3 hydrocodone pills in it. And he asked who they were, and the bottle was dirty and had obviously been under there for a while, and everybody in the car said it wasn't theirs, and the kid driving the car finally said that he would take the hit for it after the officer said that he was going to arrest all 4 of them for this. You know, you can get over an addiction, but you can't get over a conviction. It follows you for the rest of your life, even if it's simple possession of marijuana. It'll keep you out of schools, it'll keep you out of the military, out of government jobs, it'll keep you from getting a lot of government aid. And I talked this officer into dumping the pills out on the street, crushing them under his shoe, and telling the kids not to come back to town. Most police officers can't see beyond the bust. They have had it developed so much that people who use drugs are evil, and that they're there to hurt us, and that they're there to ruin neighborhoods, that they don't see the big picture. When I went through the academy, we saw a video of a South Carolina state trooper named Mark Cowles, who was in his late 20s, and he pulled over a car for, I believe it was a tail light that was out. And the guy that he pulled over had 2 strikes against him and a half a pound of pot in the trunk of his car. And that half a pound of pot would have been his 3rd strike, and it would have been life in prison without parole. He shot Mark Cowles. Mark Cowles unloaded his .357 into this guy. He was a big man. The second time the guy shot him, it went in through the armhole of his vest into his heart and killed him. And he left a wife and a young child at home because of that. And he didn't die because of marijuana. He died because of the marijuana laws, because of minimum sentencing, because of a lack of parole. When we have sentences like that, you can't reform. People don't get better in prison. We have, like I said, the biggest prison system in the world. The prison industry is actually the fastest growing housing industry in America right now. And even our maximum security prisons have drugs in them. There isn't a single one that doesn't have drugs in it. And if we can't get the drugs out of the prisons, how are we going to keep them out of the streets? A lot of people think that, you know, it's okay to legalize marijuana, but it's not okay to legalize the other drugs. LEAP is not pro-drug. They're anti-prohibition. But we recognize that if you do things like you decriminalize marijuana, where all you do is get a ticket for it, instead of going to jail, that all you're doing is affecting the users. You're not doing anything to take the profit out of the drugs and to take the drugs out of the hands of the criminals that are selling them. They have spent over $1 trillion, trillion with a T, on the war on drugs so far. Drugs are now pure, cheaper, more available than they were when they started the war on drugs. When they poll high school kids, they say it's easier for them to get pot and other drugs than it is alcohol and tobacco, because they are regulated. They can buy them from whoever has them. We currently spend about $300 billion a year on the war on drugs, which is more than we spend on education. You know, the facts are really appalling. A lot of people think, you know, this is Hempfest. It's not about being a pothead. It's about, you know, more individual liberties and why is hemp illegal? Some people believe that hemp is part of the cannabis family. It is a cousin to cannabis sativa, cannabis indica. It doesn't have the THC levels to get anybody high. You could smoke a joint the size of a phone pole, and all you get is a headache. You won't get a buzz from it. But hemp has a lot of other uses. Hemp, on 1 acre of hemp, you can get more paper in 1 year than you can get on 4 acres of timber in 20 years. And hemp is a renewable crop. It doesn't deplete the soil. You can keep growing it over and over and over. You don't have to rotate it with other crops. Hemp can be used to make plastic. It can be made to use fuel. It can solve our fuel problems and our dependence on foreign oil. It can be used for rope. One of the original Declarations of Independence was printed on hemp paper. And a lot of people believe that the reason marijuana is illegal is because of the threat hemp has to so many industries and the money behind those industries. It's not just that you could hide marijuana crops in hemp crops. It's that these people don't want to give up their timberlands, and the pharmaceutical companies sure don't want to give up their money. Hemp and other drugs have been used as long as mankind has had history, and they've been used without problems most of that time. And the pharmaceutical companies is a multi-billion-dollar industry. If they have had tests where they're treating children with CBDs now, which is one of the elements from marijuana for epilepsy, and their children that are 6 years old and they've never had 3 minutes without a seizure, and they give them some cannabis oil and suddenly their eyes light up and they look around because they can see the world without worrying about getting their next breath. It's pretty amazing stuff. There have been a lot of they call medical marijuana refugees moving to Colorado and Washington State. There are now 21 states that have legalized medical marijuana, but a lot of them are trying to limit it to just aspects of it. CBD is cannabidinol, which is one of the elements after THC that's well known, but there are over 100 chemicals in marijuana alone, and doctors say that they have to have the whole marijuana plant for what they call the entourage effect, that all those chemicals have an effect on the medical abilities of marijuana to treat different things. It's been used for Parkinson's, for MS, it's been used for fibromyalgia, it's been used for cancer. They've seen cancer disappear, they've seen cancer stop by using medical marijuana. They use it for glaucoma, which a lot of people know about. They're starting to do testing for post-traumatic stress disorder and had good results with that. Even the government's doing that. It's one of the funny things with the government is that they have a patent on synthetic THC. The brand name is Marinol. It'll cost you about $1,300 a month for just a synthetic THC to use medically, even though they have it listed as a Schedule I narcotic with a high level of abuse and no medical usefulness whatsoever. It cannot be prescribed. It's at the same level as heroin and methamphetamine, which are both actually prescribed sometimes by doctors now. I'm sorry, I'm used to having my notes out with me, and we're set up a little bit different here. I want to make sure I don't miss anything too big here. Another one of the things with LEAP is that the police officers want to go back to taking care of the neighborhoods and doing the job that they were hired to do. A lot of prisons are releasing violent criminals because the drug convictions have minimum sentencing and they don't have room for them. So they let go the rapists and the murderers. The average time served for murder is 7 years, and you have people. I drove past a billboard coming in here today that said using marijuana can get you 10 years in prison and a $25,000 fine. When I was in the military, I saw a lot of people have their careers destroyed because they were recreational pot users, and they didn't come into work high, but they had random drug tests that showed whether they'd used it or not in the last 30 days, and because they lost their careers, they lost their benefits. A lot of them lost their futures and their families. We come back to marijuana again. A lot of people here, that's their main interest, and one of the arguments that we hear about marijuana is that it is a gateway drug. Marijuana is not a gateway drug. Prohibition is a gateway. When you can't go to the store, go to your doctor and buy marijuana, you have to buy it wherever you can get it. And most of the people who are selling it have other drugs around too. And we've all been told how horrible marijuana is, and when it turns out that it isn't, then we wonder if maybe ecstasy or cocaine or PCP or heroin or some of the other drugs that are out there aren't that bad either. And some people find out they are and some don't. The majority of people who use drugs don't become addicts. They try it for a while, maybe they use it regularly for a few years, and they finish school and they get married and they have families, and they outgrow it. Like getting drunk every weekend when you're in college. You know, after a while, it's no fun sleeping in your puke or puking in your sleep, and you decide you'd rather do other things with your time. But we don't have good rates of dealing with addiction here because a lot of it is court mandated. And for many years, automobile accidents have been the leading cause of accidental death in the United States. And that has been passed by drug overdoses. And a lot of reason for that is it's unregulated products, it's not pure, it's stepped on, and even with pharmaceutical drugs like hydrocodone, Lortabs, people are afraid to call for help when somebody overdoses. They're afraid they're going to go to jail, the person who's overdosed is going to go to jail, it's going to ruin their lives, and they wait for the person to die, and then they call. Trey had mentioned that I have worked in tattoo shops. I've been a tattoo artist and body piercer and managed tattoo shops and piercing shops, and one of the guys who had apprenticed under me died about 2 months ago after he was 23 years old and had taken a good bit of Lortab and didn't feel good and went to the hospital, and they gave him a pat on the butt and sent him on his way, and he died the next day because he had damaged his body so bad, and they didn't have insurance. He'd done it to himself, so they gave him the life-saving emergency treatment and cast him out. And that's the way drug addicts or drug users are treated so much of the time. And, as I said, the drugs themselves are not particularly bad. It's what we do with them and the lack of control that we have over them. I'm going to wrap it up with that, but I would like to answer any questions people have. I can't hear you.
I've always thought that marijuana has dangerous properties and it's a health property. So in what way does the act use users to stop it or slow it down?
One of the things with marijuana being illegal is that the government has not, for the most part, allowed medical studies of it. There has, up until recently, only been one government place that they grew marijuana so that they could test it. But the studies that have been done have shown that people who smoke marijuana and don't smoke cigarettes also have a lower lung cancer rate than non-smokers.
So they provide, they give marijuana to the patient
Well, with some of the places that are doing medical marijuana, they're finding effects with it. Some people have self-medicated and found that it went away. But that's one of the things I always heard too. Now there's a lot of people are using vaporizers now, which heat up the leaf to a particular temperature, an exact temperature, where it burns off the cannabinoids rather than bringing in all the possible carcinogenics from burning the leaf itself, when it looks like it's been toasted after they use it. It's a good question. Anybody else? Sir. He asked what my thoughts were on the so-called study that they had that said that marijuana can change the shape of the brain in young people especially. That's one thing that we hear a lot, is that people under 18 are especially at risk if they use marijuana of not developing properly and ending up with losing 8 points on their IQ is what they say, and things like that. And those studies, if you do a Google on it and you check around a little bit, I just read an article about it. They had 20 people. They didn't have before results and after results. They had 20 people that smoked pot, and they said that the brain was shaped abnormally, but they couldn't determine whether it was abnormal beforehand or if it was from using the marijuana. So it's not a legitimate scientific study. They didn't have controls with it, and they didn't eliminate any other things that might affect the shape of the brain. One of the things that reminds me of is on Time magazine a couple of weeks ago, on the cover, the article was "Fake Pot." And most of us remember a year or so ago the zombies who were eating people's faces after using bath salts. And bath salts are a synthetic drug. There are synthetic marijuanas like K2 and several others. And what the people who are manufacturing it are doing is when the government says that's illegal, you can't have it or make it, they change the chemistry by just a slight enough amount that it's no longer the exact same thing anymore, so now it's legal. But they aren't under the FDA, it's not being regulated. They'll spray it on other plants for people to smoke it, and it might be concentrated a lot more in one spot than another, where the dosage of it is very uneven from packet to packet and from joint to joint of the stuff. And it's just another one of the things that prohibition has created a market for. There are over 300 different strains of marijuana now, and some of them are hybrid, some are cannabis sativa, some of them are cannabis indica, some of them are more of an upper and more creative, and others will give you couch lock. When I was a police officer, I was very pro-legalization, which was not a popular stance to take because of all the money that the police departments get for grants. They get new cars and equipment and SWAT team stuff and everything else. They get their salaries from fees and fines. And people who smoke pot stay home, eat the refrigerator, and become one with the couch, instead of get behind the wheel of the car and kill a family of five. There's the old joke about the difference between a drunk and a pothead is a drunk will blow through a stop sign and kill that family of five, and a pothead will sit at the stop sign and wait for it to turn green.